Victor Harlan liked to say, "Innovation belongs to the young." I didn't respond the day he crowned a golf buddy intern as the new leader of the project I'd spent 3 years architecting. I just watched Chase grin over the brief I wrote and felt the walls of the so-called kingdom shift. 3 days later, when he flipped to the exclusivity clause he didn't understand, the one that still listed me as the sole authorized liaison, I finally understood something Victor never would. Some empires collapse loudly. His would collapse on paper. The moment Chase arrived, something in the building shifted. Suddenly, the whispers got quieter, the meetings got selective, and Victor started walking around with the smug glow of a man who believed he'd just discovered talent in the wild. Meanwhile, my team and I had just finished laying the groundwork for the biggest project the company had touched in a decade. A logistics overhaul so complicated it needed its own glossary. We'd prototyped the framework, drafted the vendor flows, built the timeline. Every strategic piece of it lived in my head, my files, or the contract clause I'd quietly tucked into the renewal packet last year. The one that said I was the designated liaison for all things Northern Axis until Q4. But Victor didn't care about experience. He cared about optics. So when I walked into the morning meeting and saw Chase sitting at the table with dual monitors and the kind of confidence usually reserved for televangelists and mediocre men in finance, I knew something was coming, and I was right. Because the betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even surprising. It was the moment I saw Chase flip confidently through the printed project brief that I wrote, with Victor standing beside him like a proud father sending his favorite son into battle. That was the first time the room felt smaller, and the first time I realized that maybe the kingdom wasn't worth saving. So there I was, 3 years in, always half-turned toward an exit sign in my mind, still hoping Victor might one day toss me a simple, nice work. Instead, what I got was an all-hands meeting with catered bagels and a too-eager intern named Chase. But we'll circle back to that circus first. Let me take you to the golf lunch, the exact moment the fuse was lit. Victor had been weirdly upbeat that week, whistling Sinatra off-key, gliding around the office like a mall Santa wrestling with an identity crisis. My husband, sweet and oblivious, mentioned over dinner that his dad had caught up with an old golf buddy, Norris, and Norris's freshly graduated son who might be interning for a bit. "Interning," I repeated. "Just for a quarter," he said. "Kid seems sharp." "Cool," I replied, slicing my steak like it owed me rent. A week later, Chase arrived, teeth suspiciously bright, handshake engineered in a lab, shoes he clearly stole from a mannequin on his way in. Everyone treated him like the second coming of corporate Jesus. Victor personally gave him a tour. I'd been there 3 years and still parked on the gravel overflow lot next to the dumpster. Chase's desk, 2 down from mine. Dual monitors, window seat. I was still working on the laptop I bought myself as a birthday gift. By day 3, he leaned over and asked how to access the project drive. "I'll ask IT to onboard you," I said with the kind of polite smile that should qualify as an Olympic sport. And heads up, read the supplier exclusivity clauses, especially the one for Northern Axis. It's layered. He blinked. I tapped my temple. Vendor management lives up here. What I didn't say, you'll never find anything unless you know where I buried the bodies. From the moment Chase opened his mouth, I realized something important. He wasn't the villain. He was the warning label on the villain's bad decisions. Every clueless question he asked was basically a neon sign saying, "This is who Victor trusts more than you." And honestly, Chase wasn't malicious. He wasn't even ambitious. He was eager, like a corporate golden retriever who desperately wanted to fetch, but kept bringing back the wrong stick. He'd hover behind my chair with his notebook, whispering things like, "Quick question, what's an SLA again?" Or, "Do vendors need passwords?" Or, one time he asked if Q4 was code for something. Every answer I gave him made the air in the office shift. Because I wasn't just helping him, I was showing everyone just how wide the competence gap was. And every gap made Victor look worse. Chase became the mirror Victor never wanted to look into. Because when you place an untrained intern into a senior role, you don't just embarrass the intern. You expose the leader who thought it was a good idea. Every mistake Chase made was another crack in Victor's empire. And every time he asked me something he should have known, I felt the gears of the downfall click forward. Chase didn't cause the collapse, but he accelerated it with the enthusiasm of someone who thinks Tsurisi stands for cute clarification. And I was just warming up. 2 weeks after Chase descended from Golf Olympus into our fluorescent-lit purgatory, the whispers began. Copy room chatter. A messy reply-all from the CFO's assistant. Something big was brewing, bigger than usual. Something involving logistics for high-volume clients, and the proprietary framework I'd secretly been sketching between fixing invoices, babysitting suppliers, and discovering that someone named Weston tried to expense a $400 steak dinner as team bonding. This wasn't budget reshuffling or quarterly fluff. This was the project, the type you staple to your resume and let it scream with pride. And here's the kicker. I had already laid the groundwork. My team had prototyped a module that sliced lead times by 18%. Under budget, ahead of schedule, built entirely on work Chase couldn't spell yet. Then one night, while I microwaved leftovers and tried to decide whether Pinot Grigio counted as emotional wellness, my husband wandered in, grinning like he'd solved world peace. "Dad's talking about the logistics expansion," he said between bites of lasagna. "Says you basically built the whole thing. He's gonna give it to you." I didn't respond. I just sipped my wine like a woman who already knew the fairy tale ending. Spoiler, the princess doesn't get the castle. She gets passed over for the squire who once fixed a crooked gate and called it innovation. "Don't look like that," my husband said. "Sure," I murmured, right after he stops calling my department the little engine that could. And yet, hope flickered, stupid, stubborn hope. What if merit won this time? What if the late nights and spreadsheet autopsies finally meant something? The next morning, I showed up before the janitor, cleaned my inbox like I was preparing for a celestial audit, and sent Victor a set of immaculate reports. No fluff, no filler, his reply. A single thumbs up. I tried to convince myself that meant progress. I walked back to my desk after that thumbs up emoji and sat there for a moment, staring at the screen like it had personally insulted me. Funny thing is, it wasn't the dismissal itself. It was the sudden, bone-deep understanding that I could work myself into dust, and Victor would still see me as furniture with Wi-Fi. And in that moment, the last tiny piece of hope I'd been dragging around finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly broke in half, like a pencil at the end of a long exam. There's a line you cross in corporate life when you stop asking, "Why don't they see me?" and start thinking what happens when I stop holding everything together. That was the moment I crossed it, and I knew there was no going back. Until I saw him later that afternoon at the cafe across the street, sharing a salmon sandwich with Norris from golf and Norris's son, Chase, who was smiling like someone had knighted him with a bagel knife. They didn't see me watching from the sidewalk, iced coffee sweating in my hand, mapping out 3 exit strategies and a 4th that involved faking a medical emergency and escaping through the ceiling tiles. And that was the moment I knew the intern wasn't just a nuisance. He was part of a game Victor had already decided I'd lose. The moment a man starts selling your brilliance as his vision is the moment you know he's already rehearsing your replacement. Victor Harlan wasn't just borrowing my work, he was turning it into a stage prop, and Chase Carter was nodding beside him like a bobblehead who still spelled logistics with training wheels. Because every time Chase pretended to understand something, the universe quietly bookmarked the moment for later destruction. Chase stood there, nodding along while Victor waved his hands in grand arcs, performing like he was unveiling the blueprint for the next Silicon Valley miracle, my blueprint, of course. And Chase nodded with the confidence of a man who was probably still Googling what a vendor SLA even was. Back at the office, I passed his desk and spotted a sticky note stuck to his monitor that read, "Call Northern Axis guy, ask Claus." I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, long enough to question my grip on sanity, then slipped into the bathroom and screamed silently into a paper towel like a responsible professional. Still, no official announcements, no big reveal. So I kept working, kept pushing the timeline forward. That same afternoon, I got an email from Helvian's operations director, the kind of man who never wastes adjectives. He wrote, "Your last proposal was the first one that made sense. You're the reason we haven't walked." I reread it twice, let the validation settle, and then watched Victor forward it to the team with one note: "Good momentum, let's keep pushing." That night, Victor sent a company-wide email. Subject: exciting expansion. Ahead. The body was the usual corporate charcuterie board: synergies, optimization, strategic something something. But I could translate his nonsense in my sleep. A big project was coming, my project, and everyone knew it. My team buzzed with excitement, clapping me on the back and saying things like, "This is your baby, you're gonna run the whole show." I smiled, nodded, played along. But that tiny candle in the dusty attic of my brain flickered. I'd watched Victor hand empires to smiling, well-connected interns before, and I'd seen too many fresh-faced sons of important golf buddies inherit systems they couldn't spell, let alone manage. Still, I needed to see if he'd actually do it. Spoiler, he did. And with pastries, that was the first warning sign. Victor only sprung for catering when he was about to soften a blow or butter up a betrayal. The last time croissants appeared in the conference room, half the QA team got merged into marketing, and their manager learned about it from a calendar invite. So when I walked in and saw glossy trays of carbs and fruit skewers arranged like a funeral buffet, I almost pivoted straight back out. But something told me this performance would be worth watching from the front row. We filed in, department heads, project leads, interns, plural, apparently fresh blood, was his new KPI. I took my usual seat, halfway down, left side, not too close, not too far, my throne of strategic invisibility. Victor entered last, like a sitcom character arriving after the laugh track. Except this time he wasn't alone. Chase followed him, drowning in a blazer with the brand tag still attached, clinging to a laptop like it might grow teeth. I clocked everything: his jittery leg, his overdone cologne, the way he mouthed Victor's speech as if practicing lines for a school play. Victor cleared his throat. "Team," he began, dripping with condescending sincerity. "As you all know, we're entering an exciting new phase of growth." I hated it already. He clicked to the first slide. Project Ascend, a strategic future in Comic Sans, Comic Sans. I blinked. Surely this was satire. Victor droned on about trend watching and metric analyzing, completely ignoring the 5-month analytics report I'd written, the one he'd signed without reading. Then he paused, and that's when he did it. That's why I'm thrilled to announce that Chase will be leading Project Ascend as our interim strategic innovation lead. Silence, not the normal kind. The kind that eats sound. The kind that hollows a room out. Someone coughed. It sounded like a half-swallowed "what the f" before morphing into a throat clear. Even the air vent hesitated. Victor beamed. Chase stood. Yeah, really honored. Can't wait to learn, lead." I smiled and clapped. Just 3 tiny, polite claps, the kind you give a child who didn't eat glue today. Everyone followed, awkward, confused, checking for hidden cameras. Walking back to my desk after that meeting, something cold and crystalline settled in my chest. Not anger, not heartbreak, clarity. They'd spent years pretending I was invisible. Fine, let them live inside the illusion a little longer. Because invisibility cuts both ways. I opened my laptop, scrolled through 3 years of contracts, amendments, exclusivity terms, and suddenly the entire company glowed like a glass house lit from the inside. They thought they could replace me. They forgot I designed the walls. That was the moment I stopped trying to be indispensable and started preparing to be dangerous. Victor never looked at me, not once, not even a nod, not even a whisper of acknowledgement that I'd built the entire skeleton this project stood on. Every framework, every contract, every piece of back-end structure, Chase hadn't even discovered yet. All that mattered now was Chase, intern with team player, listed under skills on his LinkedIn and a Wolf of Wall Street. Quote in his About section, "After the meeting, I didn't rage, didn't cry, didn't even break stride." I drifted back to my desk, flagged a few emails, then walked calmly to the supply closet for a new notebook. Because if Victor wanted to change the game, then I needed a brand new playbook. Walking back to my desk, I realized something I'd never allowed myself to think before. I didn't need to fight for a seat at Victor's table. I built half the damn table. And if they wanted to pretend I wasn't essential, I could just as easily pretend they didn't exist. That was the moment the switch flipped. Not rage, not pettiness, precision. I stopped propping up the cracks in their foundation and started letting gravity do what gravity does. Not sabotaging, just refusing to save people who'd mistaken my labor for luck. For the first time, my competence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like leverage, and I was finally ready to use it. The moment the golden boy comes running to you for answers is the moment the entire empire reveals its cracks. Chase Carter wasn't just out of his depth. He was drowning, and every gasp he took pulled Victor's fragile kingdom 1 inch closer to collapse. Because every time Chase asked a question he should have already known the answer to, the clock on Victor's downfall ticked a little louder. Chase found me 2 hours later, sweaty, nervous, clutching a printed copy of a supplier agreement I'd authored 6 months earlier. "Hey, Marin," he stammered, tapping the page. "Do you have the original doc for this, the Northern Axis exclusivity clause? I don't totally get the renewal language." I looked at him for a long moment, long enough for him to twitch like a guilty Roomba bumping into furniture. Then I smiled, not kindly, but like a woman who'd finally stared into the void long enough to recognize its shape. "That's not my job anymore," I said, and I walked away, because it wasn't my job, not now, and definitely not for long. Victor Harlan's office always smelled like old money and terrible decisions. A mahogany desk, a leather chair that cost more than my first car, and a framed golf photo of him shaking hands with some slick executive who once tried to pitch a multi-level coffee subscription scheme. The decor screamed divorce attorney chic. I knocked once and stepped inside without waiting. He was on the phone, pretending to be busy, flipping through printouts as if they were blueprints to something other than his own incompetence. He waved me in with one finger, still talking. Yeah, we'll circle back in the onboarding doc. Touch base next week. Chase will quarterback the vendor handoff. Yep, fresh perspective, love it." Quarterback, Lord help me. He finally hung up and looked at me, trying to slip into that faux fatherly warmth he reserved for moments when he wanted to feel like a benevolent king addressing a loyal subject. "Marin," he said brightly. "Big day, huh? Exciting times? I hope you're ready to support Chase as we ramp up." Support Chase, like I was his unpaid emotional support animal. Like I hadn't built the entire machine he was about to crash into a wall. I smiled, calm as ice in a freezer. "I just wanted to thank you." He blinked. "For what?" "For the opportunity, for the experience, for showing me exactly where I stand." And I placed the envelope on his desk, white, crisp, clean. No dramatics, no flame, just truth delivered with perfect clarity. His face twitched, eyes narrowed, lips parted like he couldn't quite compute that someone had dared to reject him. He opened the envelope, pulled out the single sheet, one sentence. "I, Marin Vale, resign. Effective 2 weeks from today." His mouth opened, closed, opened again, like a fish contemplating the cruelty of existence. "You're joking," he croaked. "No," I said, using the same polite tone I reserved for teaching interns how Outlook folders worked. "I'll wrap up cleanly, no hard feelings." He leaned back in his oversized chair, looking suddenly small, like a man who'd just discovered his throne had termites. "Is this because of the project?" he asked. I tilted my head. "You made your decision, I'm making mine." He blinked, flustered. "Come on, Marin, let's be adults. You're taking this personally." "You made it personal," I said, "the moment you decided I was more useful invisible." He had no answer, just stared at the paper like he expected it to start dancing and explain how to fix the mess he'd created. I turned and walked toward the door. When I stepped out of Victor's office, the strangest thing hit me. Relief. Not because I'd quit, not because he looked like a man who'd misplaced his own spine, but because for the first time in 3 years, I didn't want anything from him anymore. Not validation, not acknowledgement, not even anger. I finally understood that recognition from the wrong person is just another form of captivity. And once I stopped wanting it, the whole building felt smaller, too small to hold. The woman I'd spent years shrinking to become, I didn't walk away for revenge. I walked away because staying was the slowest kind of self-betrayal. And with that single signature, the countdown on Victor's empire officially began. The real power move isn't leaving the room. It's leaving behind just enough silence for the consequences to echo. Victor still believed he was in control, but every word I spoke on my way out was another domino quietly tipping behind him. Because once legal clearance enters a conversation like ours, it's already too late for whoever wasn't paying attention. I paused at the door, turned back just enough for him to feel the shift. "Oh, I'll transfer access to the necessary files," I said. "Some may take time, legal clearance and all." He squinted. "Legal clearance?" I smiled wider. "Some of our contracts are delicate. You'll want legal involved, especially on the exclusivity renewals." Then I walked out before he could ask what I meant, before he could see the blind copy I'd just sent from my phone to Northern Axis Legal, subject line, Pair Clause 9C, Notice of Contractual Liaison Departure. I went back to my desk and packed slowly. No announcements, no dramatic exit, just precise, surgical closure. Every folder archived, every handoff note meticulously drafted, every file saved correctly, except a handful I intentionally left blank. Placeholders with names like Q4_, timeline_final, just to see who would panic first. By 3 p.m., the news had leaked. By 5 o'clock, whispers drifted through the break room. And by 6 o'clock, Chase tried to log into the supplier dashboard and got slammed with a restricted access pop-up. That night, over takeout, my husband blinked at me. "So you really quit?" "Yep." "Wow, I mean, Dad's going to freak." "He already did." He stared, chewing slowly. "Are you okay?" I thought about it. 3 years of grinding myself into something unrecognizable, begging silently for someone to see my worth. 3 years of being polite, strategic, invisible. "I think I am," I said, and I meant it. The next morning, I ordered business cards for my LLC. Then I sent myself one more email. Subject: "In case they come crawling." Attachment: vendor leverage, read first, 2 weeks. That's how long it took for the gears to start screaming. Not a dramatic explosion, just the slow shriek of a machine realizing its most essential screw had quietly walked out the door. It started with a Slack message, not to me, of course. I wasn't there anymore. But a former coworker forwarded me the screenshot. "Anyone have the Northern Axis contact? Procurement's hitting a wall." That wall, me. See, when I negotiated the Northern Axis agreement, I insisted on a single point of liaison for all component fulfillment, partly because I like control, let's be honest, but mostly because Carmen, their VP of Ops, despised scattered communication. One voice, one thread. That was the deal. And buried in Clause 7.2, between indemnity jargon and force majeure, was this: Authorized liaison, EMSA Vale. Transfer of liaison role requires 30-day notice and written approval from Northern Axis Legal. Guess who never filed that? Certainly not Chase. The order got kicked back. No parts shipped, no updates. Just a cordial message from Carmen's assistant. Per contract terms, we cannot process requests from unauthorized personnel. Chaos bloomed. Chase started calling every stranger on LinkedIn with vendor in their job title. No one answered. A week later, another vendor, Fulcrum Dynamics, flagged a delivery clause. Their penalty waiver only applied while I oversaw implementation. Without me, the fees hit hard, budgets ballooned, timelines slipped. The project of Comic Sans dreams started hemorrhaging money before it even launched. I didn't gloat, not out loud. But when my former assistant sent me a message that said, "Did you take the whole house of cards with you, or just the top floor?" I allowed myself one smug sip of overpriced oat milk latte. Detached curiosity settled over me. It felt like watching a reality show where you already know who's going to cheat. You're just waiting to see how messy it gets. Then came the call, not to me again, but someone leaked the Zoom transcript from a vendor check-in, and that's when the real unraveling began. Every clause I'd written was now waking up like a sleeping guard dog, and Victor's kingdom had no idea what was coming next. There's a special kind of satisfaction in watching the moment. A lie collapses under the weight of the truth it tried to replace. The illusion of Victor's brilliant innovation era didn't end with a bang. It ended with Chase Carter stumbling over a question he never should have been asked. Because once a client mentions licensing, you can always count down to the exact second someone realizes the adults have left the room. Only Chase was leading that vendor call, voice shaky, confidence leaking like a cheap inflatable pool. The client rep asked about the licensing handover for the Phase 2 IP architecture. Chase, bless his unprepared soul, said, I don't think we actually, own it. I think it's in the files Marin had, but we can figure it out later." You could hear the silence a full, echoing beat. Then the vendor replied, calm as a guillotine, "So you're saying the intellectual property you're building on isn't fully transferred?" Chase laughed. "Well, I mean, it's in the system, I think, right?" Another beat. Someone left the call. And that was it, the turning point. The moment the illusion finally shattered, and everyone realized Chase wasn't just underqualified. He was dangerously, catastrophically clueless. My phone buzzed later. Unknown number. I ignored it. It buzzed again. Ignored that too. Voicemail. Later, I listened. It was one of the junior PMS whispering, like she was confessing through a church screen. "Hey, it's a mess over here. I know you're gone, but God, Marin, they're unraveling. Victor's blaming suppliers. Chase is blaming legal. Legal is blaming procurement. It's like musical chairs on fire. Thought you'd want to know." I smiled. Not a big one, just enough to feel the muscles shift. Closed the voicemail. Opened a document labeled consulting_retainer_draft_V3. Adjusted the rate, then leaned back in my chair and watched the metaphorical smoke rise from a company that never thought I mattered until my absence became the largest presence in the room. Victor never called me. Not when my mother was in the hospital. Not when my team pulled an all-nighter to save the $1 million contract he almost nuked. Not even when I married his only son and became the daughter-in-law he loved parading around boardrooms as a decorative threat with spreadsheets. So when his name lit up my phone on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I didn't answer. I poured myself a cup of tea. Not coffee, tea, because that's what you drink when you're no longer surviving on adrenaline. He called again and again. By the fourth attempt, I picked up with the same tone I reserve for sales reps pitching miracle CRM migrations. "Hi, Victor. Marin," he said, voice sugar dipped in motor oil. "How are you?" I let silence stretch, doing all the heavy lifting. He cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to reach out. Just wanted to check in, see how things are going." I looked around the co-working suite I'd rented a week earlier. Bright windows, quiet, smelled like eucalyptus and printer ink. Paid for 6 months in advance by Northern Axis as part of a vendor strategy engagement. "I'm well," I said, smiling faintly at a glass wall where a design team was workshopping a logo involving a goose holding a lightning bolt. Sitting in that co-working suite, sunlight pouring through windows no one told me to earn, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for impact. No half-written apology emails drafted in my head. No invisible weight pressed between my shoulder blades. No quiet terror of being the only adult in a room full of men who mistook confidence for competence. I could feel myself expanding, unfolding, becoming someone I hadn't had the space to meet. And that's when it clicked. I hadn't left a job. I'd left a version of myself that survived by making other people look good. Now, I was ready to see what happened when I let myself be visible. That's great, really great. Listen, I won't waste your time. He always wasted my time. We've hit a few snags with Ascend. Minor things, of course, growing pains. But it made me think, maybe we could bring you in, just temporarily. Help smooth things out, for the good of the company. There it was. A white flag folded into a cashmere tone. I'm consulting full-time now, I said lightly. Of course. But we were thinking more, a short-term engagement, just to get us through this phase. I didn't laugh, but my tea almost did. I'd consider it, depending on the terms. A pause. Well, I'm sure we can work something out. What kind of package are you thinking? I opened a new tab, typed a number, tripled my old salary, added a vendor protection advisory clause, added a monthly retainer with a 90-day minimum. I'll send you a proposal, I said. It'll be clear. Another pause, a nervous laugh. You've certainly found your voice, huh? I always had it, Victor. You just talked over it. He chuckled, hollow and echoing, like he was standing in a hallway that had just lost all its doors. I'll look for the email. You do that. We hung up, and just like that, the empire that ignored me for 3 years was now knocking, because survival finally demanded the one thing they'd never valued, me. There's a moment right after you reclaim your power, when the universe starts returning every unpaid debt with interest. The calls started stacking up like proof that I'd never been the problem, only the solution they'd been too arrogant to credit. Because once one high-profile client walks toward you, the rest always follow the scent of competence. I stared at my phone for a beat, then turned back to my notes. I had 3 calls lined up that day, each one a tiny earthquake. One with a logistics startup, trying to poach Victor's core fulfillment strategy. The one I'd written another with a former client, quietly preparing to move their contract away from his company. And a third with Stratiform Dynamics, ready to finalize the consulting package they'd offered me the day after I walked out. People were noticing. People were remembering. Not the fireworks or the handshakes, but the results. The 2 a.m. emails, the salvaged shipments, the polite but lethal follow-ups that turned maybe into absolutely. Back at the company, the interns whispered that Chase had started forwarding all vendor requests to procurement, with "please advise" in the subject line. He scheduled a brainstorming lunch with marketing to rebrand the confusion. His new nickname was Captain Slide Deck, which felt generous. Victor never mentioned Chase during our call. He didn't have to. Later that afternoon, I emailed over the retainer contract, watched the read receipt ping less than 5 minutes later. No reply that night, but the next morning a wire transfer hit my account, followed by a single-line email. Consider us retained. I printed it out, taped it above my desk in the co-working suite, and titled it, My Favorite Apology. Victor always believed clients were loyal to the logo, that the letterhead was what kept them around, that relationships were decoration, not infrastructure. He was wrong. It started with an email forwarded from a friend still inside the company subject line. Urgent account escalation, Helvian Group. Helvian was one of their whales. Multi-year engagement, high margin, infamously demanding. The kind of client that didn't blink at a high six-figure scope increase, but would riot if a dashboard loaded 5 seconds too slowly. I'd managed them personally for 2.5 years. Their operations director once sent me a Christmas card with a bottle of whiskey and a handwritten note. "You're the reason this circus stays in town." So when Helvian requested a meeting with Victor and the board to discuss the viability of continued engagement, the translation was obvious. They were preparing to walk. The leaked meeting minutes arrived a few days later. Courtesy of another friend, paranoia is an art. Hers included screen recorders. Victor opened the call with forced charm. "We know there have been bumps, but the new team is more than capable." Helvian's lead strategist cut him off. "With all due respect, your new team couldn't find a project timeline if you nailed it to their foreheads." Victor laughed. Wrong move. They weren't joking. "We're terminating the current contract unless Marin Holt is re-engaged, effective immediately." Victor scrambled. Legal complications, transition concerns, whatever excuse he could reach for. Helvian replied, "No need. We've already signed a direct contract with her firm. If your company wants to continue the relationship, you'll coordinate through her." The soundbite of the century. I played it 3 times on loop while eating leftover Thai food in my suite. Vindication doesn't always arrive with trumpets. It often arrives as a cold, clean memo from a billion-dollar client that says, "We'd prefer to work with her directly." Victor tried spinning it to the board. He called it strategic delegation. Finance called it cost redistribution. But everyone could see the truth in the numbers. Helvian accounted for nearly 18% of revenue last quarter. And now that revenue flowed through my LLC, and they weren't the only ones circling back. Because once one cornerstone client defects, the entire foundation begins shifting toward the person who actually held it up. Momentum has a funny way of compounding once you stop asking permission to succeed. What began as one client shift quickly spiraled into a quiet migration. The kind that makes executives sweat through their tailored suits. Because when mid-tier clients start moving in packs, it's never random. It's a sign the ecosystem is evolving without its original apex predator. 2 other mid-tier clients reached out through back channels, quiet lunches, cautious hypotheticals, the kind of conversations people initiate when they're testing the temperature of betrayal. One even sent flowers to my co-working suite with a card that read, "In case you're still accepting miracles." I was. Every new inquiry felt like justice wired directly into my bank account. That's when Victor's mask began to crack. My inside source whispered that the board had started demanding real weekly updates. Actual numbers, not the pastel gradient PowerPoints and handshake stock photo nonsense he loved trotting out, like a motivational speaker who'd never met a spreadsheet. The last board meeting apparently ended with a senior member saying, "You told us the intern could carry the torch. So far, all he's lit is our reputation." Chase had tried blaming the legacy systems, which was adorable considering those systems had my fingerprints on most of the logic trees. Then he planned a 2-day offsite to align vision, which I'm fairly certain involved whiteboards and a Spotify playlist called Innovation Vibes. Meanwhile, I was knee-deep in NDSE as coordinating client migrations, and interviewing candidates for an assistant. A real one this time, not the mythical assistant Victor promised every quarter before patting my shoulder and saying, "Budgets are tight, kiddo." What stung him most, I think, wasn't the loss of control. It was the realization that his clients had seen my value long before he ever bothered to. He built his kingdom on the assumption that people stayed loyal to logos. I built mine on relationships, receipts, and the quiet understanding that when you give everything to someone who refuses to see you, your absence eventually becomes a sinkhole. By the end of the week, my calendar was booked solid. By the end of the month, I'd already made more money than the last 3 quarters combined. So when Victor reached out again, this time via a carefully worded email CCing 2 board members, I had a reply ready. As previously stated, all communications will go through my client portal. My team will be in touch regarding terms. No best, no kind regards, just Maren. And somewhere across town, the boardroom felt like a crime scene. Not of a person, but of an illusion. Emergency session. No pastries this time, just tension thick enough to chew. Victor sat at the head of the table, suit slightly askew, hair a little too flat, swagger finally evaporated. Across from him sat legal counsel, flipping through a red folder labeled Exit Agreements, Holt M. The only sounds were a dying fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the CFO whispering to compliance like they were coordinating a hostage negotiation. The VP of Ops sat pale and tight-lipped. Chase, 3 seats down, had suddenly become fascinated with the wood grain of the table. "Let's begin," the board chair said. Legal cleared her throat, eyes razor-sharp. After reviewing the exit documentation executed by Mr. Warren, Victor stiffened. "We've identified several significant oversights." Victor leaned forward. It was a standard offboarding. I saw nothing unusual. Legal slid a copy of my signed paperwork across the table. "Section D, Clause 4B, she said, tapping the page. "This language grants Ms. Holt ongoing rights to the IP framework she authored, unless formally reassigned with board approval." And that was the moment the board realized the foundation they'd been so proud of wasn't theirs to stand on anymore. There's a special silence that follows the truth, a kind that doesn't ask permission before rearranging the room. What happened next wasn't drama. It was the sound of consequences. Catching up to a man who thought paperwork was beneath him. Because once you mishandle an IP clause, every other mistake you buried starts crawling into the light. A long, uncomfortable silence settled over the boardroom. Victor blinked, slowly, mechanically, like someone rebooting. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I would never." "You signed it," Legal replied, calm as a winter storm. Initialed, time-stamped, verified. He looked like he'd swallowed a stapler. "She was just leaving," he sputtered, sweat collecting at his collar. "It was a courtesy form. She didn't own anything." Legal didn't flinch. Ms. Holt built the vendor matrix architecture. She negotiated the exclusivity deals. She drafted the IP schema, and under this agreement, she retained all documentation and distribution rights, not explicitly claimed by the company before her departure, which you did not do. The board chair leaned forward, voice a razor. "So she owns the operational spine of Project Ascend." Legal nodded once, yes. "And since you never filed the IP transfer, she also holds rights to the internal tools powering your pilot clients." HQ implosion. The CFO dropped his pen. The VP of Ops muttered, "Jesus Christ." One of the external advisors pulled out his phone and started typing frantically, no doubt texting his assistant to polish his resume. Victor looked around the table like someone had moved the walls. This is insane. She was my daughter-in-law. The board chair didn't blink. And that personal bias, he said, may be exactly why we're here. Victor opened his mouth again, but legal cut in, sharper this time. You also failed to initiate revocation of her data access, which means she still has access to your internal systems. Someone barked from the far end of the table. Legal shook her head. No, she revoked her own access and sent confirmation. She did your job for you. Silence fell again, heavy, suffocating. Then, almost invisibly, Chase stood. No words, no excuses. He just gathered his laptop, his half-used notepad, and slipped out the door. No one stopped him. Victor watched him leave, jaw clenched, knuckles white against the armrests. What do you want us to do? He finally asked the board chair, voice afraid whisper. The chair didn't look at him. He looked at legal. Options. Negotiate, she said, humbly, respectfully, and fast. Across town, I sat at my desk in the co-working suite, sipping cold brew and scrolling through an email thread from one of my newer clients. Ironically, a startup obsessed with emotional intelligence in leadership. My assistant pinged me. Emergency board meeting just wrapped. Insider says you dropped a bomb. I smiled, opened a blank document, and titled it, Retainer Adjustment, Board Rate. Because the next conversation wasn't going to be about feelings. It was going to be about value. That night, I stepped into a ballroom thick with the clink of ice in whiskey glasses and a jazz soundtrack. No one was actually listening to investors. In suits that cost more than my retainer milled around, trading forced laughter and expensive insecurity. Buzzwords floated through the air like overpriced hors d'oeuvres. Scalable, agile, synergy, empty sounds wearing cologne. Victor stood just inside the entrance, scanning the room like he still believed people wanted to talk to him. He looked thinner, not physically, just deflated. A man who once walked into rooms assuming gravity bent for him, now quietly realizing it never had. And as his world shrank, mine kept expanding, built on the foundations he never cared to understand. There's a certain power in walking into a room you were never supposed to survive, and being the one everyone stands up straighter for. By the time Victor noticed me, the story had already changed hands, and I wasn't the one holding the fragile ending anymore. This was the moment every quiet receipt, every late-night negotiation, every overlooked contribution finally circled back. He spotted me before I even registered he was in the room. I was laughing, genuinely, shaking hands with a partner from Dovetail Technologies, a competitor his company once tried to reel in back, when swagger and a functioning vendor pipeline were still part of their vocabulary. The partner guided me toward the table, even pulled out a chair with a kind of deference Victor only ever extended upward, never sideways, and certainly never to me. I felt his stare before I met his eyes. He stood frozen mid-sip, a half-glass of scotch trembling in his hand, the familiar twitch of disbelief etched deep into his brow, like he still couldn't process how the woman he'd dismissed as background noise had quietly, methodically replaced him in rooms like this, rooms he once believed existed solely for men like him. One of the board members stepped up beside him, an older guy, one of the rare few who never tried to mansplain supply chains to me during Q2 earnings calls. He nodded toward me, then murmured, almost pitying, "She saved what she could, we lost everything else." Victor didn't answer. He just watched. He had the expression of a man standing in the street while his house burns, staring at the neighbor's garden party and realizing the laughter coming from their yard is his former life, moving on without him. Across the room, a contract folder slid across our table. A logistics firm I'd brought over just hours earlier, a former client of his. The new CTO signed first, then the partner, then me, Marin Holt, strategic advisor. My signature was the final one needed to close a six-figure deal they'd chased unsuccessfully for a year. I didn't look over at Victor. I didn't need to. There was no victory lap, no dramatic pivot, no pointed smirk. Just that rare crystalline stillness where you realize the war is over, not because you won, but because you stopped needing to fight. He built his company like a family heirloom, polished, inherited, assumed. I built mine with contracts, leverage, and long memory. The woman once tucked into a nameless corner office had become the one they introduced with firm handshakes and words like essential, irreplaceable, foundational. I rose from the table. The partner lifted his glass. "To clean exits," he said. "To clean beginnings," I corrected. Across the ballroom, Victor turned and walked out. I didn't follow, and that was the truth of it. Legacy is inherited, but power is earned, quietly, consistently, relentlessly, until the room finally adjusts to the space you take up. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that corporate kingdoms don't crumble quietly. And this wasn't the last time a story like this would play out in someone's fluorescent-lit empire. So stick around, my boardroom renegades. Subscribe, drop a comment, and buckle in. Because the next story might just feel uncomfortably familiar.